So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Donovan Rypkema.
Thanks. Well, thing one, you've heard, I can sit down now. I mean, from the chairman on down, I don't have anything more to add to any of that. Number two, any students in here? Raise your hand. Well, good news is I talked to the two faculty people here, and for being here tonight, you get an A for the semester. I just want you to know. So, and then the third thing, I have a confession to make, and that is I have what I refer to as one-stop integrity. And that is, anytime I learn something from some place or some person, the next stop down the road, I give them full credit. 2 stops down the road, every good idea was my idea. So I'm telling you, this property tax ordinance, that's my idea 2 stops from now. Thank you all for being here, and I'm really enjoying it. So what I want to do is talk about this issue about historic preservation with older housing stock and its role in providing affordable housing. I read a quotation a few years ago from a Broadway producer, and it was, if you can't write your idea on the back of my business card, you don't have a clear idea. So here is the back of the business card version of what I'm going to talk about. We're systematically tearing down what's affordable, and we're building what's not. And that's led to this crisis that we're in. So here's some of the things you're going to hear is that there really is an affordability crisis, and it's not confined to Charlotte or Mecklenburg County or North Carolina. It's you'll see everywhere. Older and historic buildings. I'm going to talk about older and historic buildings in the U.S. I'm going to talk about how older and historic buildings meets the affordability needs, about how preservationists feel about affordability housing and ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, and then some ideas for what it's worth that I probably stolen from somebody 2 sites ago. So some kind of realities. First, there really is a crisis in affordable housing. This isn't some like political group's thing of the day. This really is fundamental, absolutely, unequivocally, factually correct. There is a crisis in affordable housing, and it's happening every place. It's not isolated. And we have some good programs, but relying on existing affordable housing programs will not by itself solve the problem. Here's the only useful thing you'll hear from me all night. You cannot build new and rent cheap, period, new exception. You can't build new, rent or sell cheap. Can't be done unless there's hugely deep subsidies. And it's not just the housing affordability. It also affected by proximity, how close you are to work, to schools, to shopping, whatever. And just mantra. Every time we tear down a unit of housing built prior to 1970, we've torn down a unit of affordable housing, period. So just recognize it. You issue a building permit or demolition permit for a 1965 building, you're giving a permit to tear down a unit of affordable housing. It just is, it is. So raise your hand if you recognize this person. Okay, it's Jack Webb was he had a great 2 different shows. They were the same show with 2 different names. Badge 714 or Dragnet were the 2 shows, and he was just Los Angeles detective, and his standard line was, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." So I'm going to just give you the facts here. First of all, this housing cost burdened. What that means that more than 30% of the household income is being spent on housing costs. Just some kind of basic definition. Severely housing cost burdened means that more than half of the household income is being spent on housing. And 49% of renter households in America, think about this, half of renter households in America are housing cost burdened, including 26% of that's severely. So a quarter of our fellow citizens who are renters are severely housing cost burdened. There's 11.8 million renter households who are severely cost burdened. So you have 10 times the population of all of Mecklenburg County across the country is severely housing cost burdened. And again, we heard this, 73% of very low income households receive no housing assistance, nothing. And you can hear people saying, oh, well, yeah, but there's all these programs to help people out and blah, blah, blah. Well, no, there aren't. No, there aren't. The vast majority, there's nothing. They're just there. The per unit cost of using the low income housing tax credit, and I'm going to come back to that, ranges between $200,000 and $250,000. Some markets more than double that. 24% of 65 old people like me, 65-year and older households are renters. That's up from 14% in 2001, and 73% of the other end, 20 to 34, are now renters, again up from 60% in 2001. So because of lack of down payment or ability to make mortgage or get a loan, shifting to renter households, nothing wrong with that, except the renting stuff is killing. So here's where that housing cost burden is. And again, we think, well, they managed to buy a house, there must not be a problem for them. Well, not true. So 22% of owners are housing cost burdened, and 10% of owners are severely housing cost burdened. And then again, the renters, almost half in the country, are housing cost burdened, and a quarter severely housing cost. So it's a real problem, broad spread, renters, owners, everybody. And here's the map of where there's rent-burdened households. There's almost no white spots. The only white spots are the places in northern Nevada where there's no people living, or northern South Dakota where I come, where it's all prairie and 6 people live every 40,000 miles or something. I mean, it's every place. This is a national crisis situation. So here's a part of the reason. Here is the changes in household income over the last 20 years. Household income's going up, fine. Here is the change in rent. Here is the change in housing prices. Well, you can't have these lines separating with incomes going up at this level and housing costs going up that level and not expect to have a severe housing crisis. Here is the North Carolina numbers. There's the median household income in North Carolina as it's changed since 1987. And then here is how the house prices and rental prices have changed in North Carolina. So the same thing that's happening nationally is happening here. Here is what's happened in household income in North Carolina. It's gone up 185%. That's great, but housing costs up 275%. So it's getting behind, always getting behind. So affordable housing is going to remain a challenge over the next decade, and here's why. Here's the good news. 6 million jobs are going to be created in our economy over the next decade. Great news. A third of those jobs are in 3 job categories. That is, the health assistant kind, and retail clerks and people working in food processing. Median pay for those jobs, $23,000 a year. A third of our jobs that are being created, everybody, I don't care, Republicans, Democrats say, well, great economy, you're generating all these jobs. Yeah, but a third of them are at this $24,000 a year, and what can they afford? $600 a month. Well, how many apartment units in Charlotte or Mecklenburg County are available for $600 a month? So the problem's getting worse. But I got to give you some really geeky stuff. I'll apologize for it if you doze off during this. It's perfectly understandable. After that great meal, by the way, that was fabulous. So I'm a market economy guy, and there is such a thing as the law of supply and demand. And here's what the law of demand is. There's laws of each of them. Law of demand is when the price of any product increases, then its demand will fall. When the price decreases, the demand will increase in the market. That's the law of demand. Law of supply says when the price of a product increases, the quantity of the product suppliers offer will increase. When its price decreases, the quantity of the product will decrease. Well, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We have this increase in demand, there's not the increase in supply. The increase in prices, there's not a falling demand. None of the things that under the market economy premises of law of supply and demand are working. It is a market failure. It's called a market, and this isn't some like socialist Marxist thing. It comes from Adam Smith, that when the marketplace does not meet the laws of supply and demand, there is a market failure. And here I wrote the sentence to understand it. When markets fail, The individual incentive for rational behavior do not lead to rational outcomes for the group. In other words, each individual makes the correct decision for themselves, but those prove to be wrong decisions for the group as a whole. And again, this is not Marxism. This is just what happens in market failure, and that's exactly what's happening in the housing market in the U.S. today. It's the old definition of inflation: too much money chasing too few goods. And again, we see the housing prices up. That's because the buyers are doing it. And when there is market failure, and I'm a market guy. I'm a believer in the marketplace. But when the market fails, it means there has to be intervention in the market, and that usually comes from the public sector. And exactly what we heard here that the city and the county are doing is intervening, because the market by itself is not solving the problem. So that's kind of the situation in terms of the affordable housing crisis. So something about older and historic housing in the United States. By the way, this one with the red roof, that was my daughter used to teach at the University of Louisville, and that was the house she bought for $98,000 or something in a wonderful old neighborhood in Louisville. So some myths about older and historic building stock. One, it's too small to meet current needs. It's falling down and not worth saving. I hear these all the time. It isn't what today's market or buyers are looking for. Well, let's figure out who the market is, what the market is. So what you're seeing is that and I've picked the year 1970 because it's 50 years ago. And sometimes you'll hear preservationists say, well, this property is historic when it's 50 years old. No, that's not really what it is. But the 50-year thing is that's when we ought to be asking the question, are there reasons for this property to be designated historic? So that just made a kind of convenient time. So numbers you'll hear before and after 1970. So owners in about a little over a third are owners in housing built after 1970, about a third, a little less than a third, owners in pre-1970 housing, about 14% renters in pre-1970 housing, and about 21% of renters in post. So that's just where the market is. And the 52 million, almost 53 million housing units are 50 years older and are about 37% of all housing units. So this is just setting the stage about what we have to look at. Now, I've heard people say, yeah, the only thing is keeping that old house standing is the termites are holding hands. It's going to fall down any time. Well, we all know about the U.S. Census of Population every 10 years, but the federal government also does a census of housing. And so we looked at older housing in the census of housing, and here's what we found, is that 2% of that housing, this is pre-1970 housing, 3% or 2% of it is severely inadequate, so maybe that's the stuff that has to go. Another 5% is moderately inadequate, and maybe some of that has to go. But what that means is 93% of that is not in that inadequate standard. Now, maybe it needs some roof repairs, maybe it needs like Beth's organization to do some repairs of some kind. But that doesn't mean that we have to throw it away. It's factually incorrect to think this old stuff is just throwawayable. So here's the distribution of that pre-1970 housing. About 3/4 of it is in single families, which generates its own challenge, and we can talk about that later. But then here you look at the across the country at the rental rates for housing costs, rental and ownership of what's less than 500 or less than 1,000, preponderance of pre-1970 housing. You get to between 1,000 and 2,000, over 2,000, preponderance of new housing. Now, this is not going to surprise anybody, but that's what's happening, is that older housing is what's provided affording. Now, who lives in that 1970 housing? Well, these are income brackets, and it's almost a straight line from the top. The less income you have, the more likely you are to live in older housing. Now, the second part of that is who lives there by age. So you're picking on old people like me. Again, as age increases, the likelihood of living in older housing increases. And then when you think about the poverty level, is that the share of all households that are in pre-1970 housing, 37% are in the poverty level. And the share of households that are 50% of the poverty level are 40% of that housing. And if you look at the between 50 and 99% of the area median income, you have 42%. So that's where our brothers and sisters, fellow citizens that are on the lower edge of the economic spectrum, where they're living is in older housing. Also, older housing disproportionately serves those who are often underserved. The disabled, African Americans, elderly, Hispanic populations, those who we haven't in the past been sufficiently concerned with, are in fact disproportionately living in this older housing. So once again, we throw away that unit of affordable housing. It's one of these groups that in fact are being adversely affected the most. There are in America today about 5 million vacant housing units built prior to 1970. 5 million. Now, you say, well, maybe that's all in the little towns, and a lot of it's there, and some of it's in places like Detroit and other places, and yeah, that's it. So it's not an equal distribution. But I just today read I live in Washington, D.C., read a story, 2,900 vacant housing units in Washington, D.C. Certainly not a struggling economy in Washington, that many, so it's this is what they are. Now, there's this 4.8 million vacant pre-1970 housing, including 745,000 that have been vacant for more than a year, so it's not like just somebody moved out last week. The U.S. housing shortage, kind of depending on who makes the estimate, the numbers change, but a good, reliable estimate says we're short of about 6.5 million housing units nationwide. If 75% of the housing shortage could be met simply by occupying the currently vacant pre-1970 housing. Now, that's not a solution. It's where the person has a housing need in Charlotte, having a vacant house in Cleveland doesn't help much. But the fact is, this is how we have to think about it. We've got vacant stuff, and a huge amount of our housing shortage could be remedied with just using stuff that's been vacant. We're falling behind in affordable housing units. It disproportionately meets the needs of people of modest financial means. But here's what's happened. Wonderful program. Some of you have used it or supported it, low-income housing tax credit. Been around for 35 years or so. Wonderful program, federal program, great program. Generated over that time about 3.5 million affordable housing units, low-income housing tax units. Great. Same time period, we've lost 11.5 million housing units built prior to 1970. We're never going to catch up, never going to catch up if we're tearing down that stuff. It's not going to work. We're falling behind in affordable housing units. Again, 3.5 million built using the low-income housing tax credit, 11.5 million torn down. Now, to put that in context, that means every year, we lost 330,000 housing units, 900 a day, 7 days a week for the last 35 years. We've lost those housing. And for those of us who are preservationists, who think about the older stuff, so 8 million of those were housing units built prior to 1940, the one that most of us would say, yeah, that's a historic house, so we're losing it. And again, it was mentioned earlier, 94% of pre-1970 housing have no protection. There's nothing keeping them standing. Well, if half of the pre-1970 housing that was demolished over the last 35 years had been rehabilitated instead, we would have no housing shortage in the United States. Think about it. So it seems like a very complicated problem, and it is, but the fact, if we simply hadn't torn that stuff down, we wouldn't have no housing shortage. And here, even if you don't care about gargoyles and cornices, here is why to think about, if the only thing you care about is fiscal responsibility and saving taxpayers' dollars. Great research firm in Washington, wasn't ours, did a study of the last decade or so of the use of the low-income housing tax credit. Here's what they found, that the average cost per unit for those who use the low-income housing tax credit building new buildings was about $210,000 a unit. Now, again, this varies a lot. San Francisco, it's $650,000 or whatever, but average nationwide, $209,000. The average cost for units in existing buildings, including the acquisition of the building, was $154,000. So if the only thing you care about is saving taxpayers' dollars, you ought to be saying priority on using existing buildings. Or if you're less concerned with fiscal responsibility and more social justice person, say we need to generate more units, then we ought to be doing old buildings. Either way, we ought to be, in fact, using older buildings as part of it. And then the same study went on to look at the life cycle costs and found that those older buildings were $40,000 to $70,000 less expensive, or the newer buildings, $40,000 to $70,000 more expensive operating them over the next, the lifetime of the building. And so while there's both a fiscal and a kind of social justice argument for using existing structures, that's not what's happening. 50 to 60% of them, 55 to 60% of them, in fact, are in new construction. So I have a wonderful colleague, Alyssa Freistek. We're a giant firm of 6 people, and we live in 6 different cities. And one of them, Alyssa, is our data guru, and she lives in Chicago in a wonderful neighborhood. And she was just taking a walk one day around her neighborhood and just noticed these 3 residential units. One, an early 20th century apartment house, one, a kind of 1950s apartment house, and then a recently built kind of condominium building. So we dug into the cost per square foot of those units. You know, $1.15 for the 1909 building, $1.50 for the mid-century building, $2.50 for the new building. Again, it's just kind of the exact example in a kind of microcosm of what we're seeing across the country. I think that the preservationist response to the affordable housing crisis is shotguns, bungalows, and row houses. And let me tell you why. The prime market for these kind of houses ought to be 1- and 2-person households who are renters, empty nesters, and first-time home buyers. And here's why, is that 28% of all households in America are 1-person households, 1 person. And another third are 2-person households. So you have 60% of all the households in America that are 1 or 2 people. You don't need 4,500 square. Now, I'm not against people having a wonderful big house of 4,500 square feet, but if we're addressing affordability, we have to look at who most of the market is, and that's small households. And older housing stock, the idea that it's too small for the market, well, it's too small for your luxury McMansion market, but that's not where we're looking to meet the demand. And that pattern of growth of 1 and 2 people households is continuing into the at least intermediate term future. Now, what's happening in the marketplace? So 57% of first-time home buyers bought a house built prior to 1950. So most of those first-timers are finding the affordability in older housing. And less than 30% of first-time home buyers bought a home that was 20 years old or less. Now, the National Association of Realtors does a great job of data. They're a great data research department. And they look at, of course, people buying. And they looked a few years ago at millennials. And sometimes, people say, well, that historic preservation stuff, that's fine for you old people. Millennials don't care about that stuff. Well, millennials constituted 34% of all buyers, but 59% of the buyers of pre-1912 housing, 44% of housing built between 1912 and 1960. So, in fact, a huge share of the market is, in fact, not old people, as young people. And in the housing survey, the feds do surveys about, well, how does your new house, where you live now relative to where you lived before? And those reporting, well, have a better house. About 52% of those who were built after 1970 said it's a better house. 60% said that for pre-1970. So it's buyer satisfaction. They moved up, moving into an old house. And then, again, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but this issue of it's not just rent or mortgage payment, it's transportation. This issue of where do I have to go to get a job? In Arizona, before the last crash, they called it drive till you qualify. You keep driving out of town till you find someplace where the land's so cheap you can afford to buy it. Well, so this issue of cost of transportation is a critical one, and again, much more likely that there be available public transportation in older neighborhoods than new for lots of reasons we can talk about. My own suspicion of why this older housing stock really appeals to young people, particularly millennials and others, is the 3 C's. The character of the neighborhood they're buying into. They want someplace that's not boring. On the cost, how much it's costing to buy it, and the convenience, the proximity to where they work, where they live, whatever. And if you think about older neighborhoods, usually mixed in use, usually walkable, they're usually proximate to jobs, shopping, whatever. Not true, less true at least, of newer neighborhoods. We were doing a study a few years ago in Miami-Dade County, and while we were working, there was this, they had designated this little neighborhood of shotgun houses, historically African-American neighborhood in Miami, and a great headline in the Miami Herald, so I kept it. These houses are old, humble, and made of wood, but they're also now historic landmarks. So really a recognition that had, maybe it's not architectural character, but there was a cultural importance to those houses that merited them being protected. Now, we also hear about the tiny house movement. Oh, the big New Deal is the tiny house movement. No. Historic houses are the original tiny house. There's 12, almost 13 million pre-1970 houses were smaller than 1,000 square feet. Now, you got 4 kids and 2 wives. That's not big enough. But for a 1- and 2-person household, in fact, it is. Now, the preservation movement often gets accused of being the NIMBYs, not in my backyard and blah, blah, we don't want any of that. So my firm does periodically what we call our Pres polls. We do surveys, online surveys. Then the respondents are mostly preservation professionals. People like Stuart, who works full-time in preservation, might be for a city, might be a consultant, but full-time preservation. So these are the pros in the area. And you know the surveys where you have a little button and you can move. So one of them, how serious is the affordability issue in the city you live? And the stretch was from housing affordability is not a problem, housing affordability is a problem but not a crisis, or housing affordability is a crisis in my community. At that end is where most of the responses were. And then relative to the rest of the community, how affordable is housing in historic districts in your community? And bad news. In fact, that 80% said either it was somewhat affordable or not affordable. So it means that historic districts are suffering from this as well. And then they were asked about which tools have been used in your community to address it. Well, almost a third used grants for repairs. Everything else fell below that. Almost no use of the rest of these tools. Again, you can't solve the problem if you don't have the tools to do it. So very low use of those. But here's what they thought the effectiveness of it. So here you have tools. These people are saying these are effective tools, but their towns or cities are not using them. Then another one of our questions was, what role, if any, should preservationists be playing in addressing the issues of affordable housing? And at one end was preservationists should concentrate on preservation. In the middle was preservationists should address affordable housing, but that should not be a primary role. And the far end was preservationists should be leading affordable housing efforts. That end of the scale. So preservationists are really saying, this is a problem in my community, and we need to be not just passively, saying we got to be concerned, we need to be leading that effort. Then we did a separate poll on ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, that have been controversial in some places, on how preservationists felt about ADUs. So did your city have legislation related to ADUs? About 2/3 said yes, we do. And then importantly, if your city adopted an ADU ordinance, should historic districts be exempt from the provisions? 3/4 said no, we shouldn't be exempt. That would apply to historic districts, just we have the same responsibility as the rest of the community has. Talked about possible positive outcomes. At the top of the list was affordable housing, and then efficient use of existing building stock, increased density. All good motivations. Possible negative consequences, and keep this in mind, policymakers, used for short-term housing rather than permanent residence. I was in New Orleans 10 days after Katrina on a ULI panel. And after that horrible event, one of the positive things in New Orleans was housing affordability for the next 8 or 10 years. It was very affordable because so many people left, a bunch of vacancies, so it was affordable. Ain't true no more. Mostly driven by this, by, Airbnbs or what they call. So what's your personal opinion on ADUs? Strongly opposed, haven't made up my mind, strongly in favor. Again, preservation professionals, strongly in favor. So here's some random stuff. Yeah, I don't have any responsibility. I just can show up, say something, and depart. So keep that in mind. But some ideas, and one of them, and I know you have Beth has a great nonprofit organization that does 30 houses a year in kind of emergency repair stuff. But one of my favorite incentives, about a third of the work we do is making policy recommendations for local governments. And in San Antonio, they have a program called Under One Roof. And the logic of it is this. Biggest enemy of houses, water. Where does water come from? The roof. So fix the damn roof. And that's what they do. They focus on people of modest means in older housing. And there's $9,000 kind of grant. Here's the list of approved contractors that know how to do it. End of story. Simple in implementation, relatively modest, huge impact. And the city council member, who's the big proponent of this, told me, a bunch of my other council members are saying, well, yeah, but there could be other problems. There could be a crumbling foundation. He said, I don't care. The fact is, we put the roof on, people can live there for another 15 or 20 years. Demolition should cost more. There is not a landfill in America where the lifetime costs of that landfill are paid for by the dumping charges. And some demolition contractor will say, well, what are you telling me? I go out and I pay every time I dump stuff. Yeah, but you're not paying the total cost of that load over the lifetime of that thing. What that means is the rest of us taxpayers, because most landfills are publicly owned, the rest of our taxpayers are subsidizing people who are throwing stuff away. It's that simple. Pass a deconstruction ordinance. Again, sometimes stuff has to go. Everything can't be saved because of its condition, because the school needs a new part, whatever. Some stuff has to go. So instead of just mowing it down, take it to the landfill, and a third of everything at the landfill, by the way, is construction debris. In fact, we recover this and reuse it. In San Antonio, they passed a deconstruction ordinance, and much of those materials then are used by nonprofit housing developers for lower income, modest, affordable housing. By the way, we're doing a project in Tacoma, Washington, and we did some focus groups, and one of the people had such a great line. Of course, Washington State, big lumber production state, and he said, people say that we've lost all of our old growth forests. He said, no, we haven't. They're in those houses in our historic districts. That's where our old growth forests are. A mitigation fund for demolition. Now, some of you are on the geeky side of preservation know that the federal preservation law has a thing called 106 review. That is, if federal action is taken or federal money is spent to do something, widen a highway, build an airport, whatever, there has to be an analysis of if that is going to adversely affect historic resources. And if it does, then that agency spending the money either has to change their plans or come up with a mitigation strategy, whatever. Well, maybe we should do that for demolition. That if you're tearing stuff down, we're losing a unit of affordable housing, then pay a mitigation for, in fact, taking from our community a house that somebody of modest means could occupy. Code enforcement policies. Again, I don't know Charlotte or Mecklenburg County, but in too many places, building inspectors, code inspectors will just say, it's too complicated, it's too far gone, slap a demo permit on it. We have to rethink about that. Say maybe we should stabilize that, maybe we should buy it, maybe we should deconstruct it, maybe something other than just mow it down. In the National Register of Historic Places, there are things called multiple resource districts. So we might have a place where we have a bunch of Catholic churches or Protestant churches, and they're scattered around the city, but they're historic. And so we create an historic district that's not bound by a line on the map. It's bound by these multiple resources. Well, maybe we ought to think about that for housing affordability. Identify affordable houses and make an historic district out of them. The issue about historic preservation, it's almost the only tool we have to keep stuff from being torn down. So have to think about what's the appropriate use for that. I think we need to have standards appropriate to the buildings, that every, bungalow in Charlotte is not, it's not the same as Mount Vernon, and what are the appropriate standards for that building. We have, in recent years, in our recommendation to cities, if they're creating new historic districts, we have said that when they create that district, they should simultaneously make it an affordable housing district. We don't even know what that means, except to say, let's concentrate whatever tools the city has on that historic district when we create it, so that this fear of being priced out of the neighborhood or rapid change at least is mitigated, saying we're also concerned about affordability. Maybe cities should look and say, and this is what new legislation actually in Washington they just passed, is that the city move in and acquire and stabilize vacant older housing units. Do it. Keep it in the marketplace. And then here's one for you. Now, you'll say, who's doing that? And my answer will be, I don't think anybody's doing it. I just made it up. But for the city or the county to have the first right of refusal on any pre-1970 house. Now, that doesn't obligate the seller to sell or the buyer to buy, doesn't obligate anybody to anything. It simply says, if I have a 1965 house and I put it on the market for X number of dollars, that then the city has 10 days or whatever to say, we'll meet that price, we'll take it, and then do something with it. I have a strong suspicion that the school districts, the city and county government, for people like cops and firefighters and teachers, have trouble hiring them because they say, I can't afford to live here. Well, maybe this ought to be the first tier of kind of signing bonus. Hey, if you go to work for the police department in Charlotte, we'll find you a house that we've acquired in this process. Again, I think our firm has become big fans of our auxiliary dwelling units. And what's interesting, in the preservation world around the country is divided. Some say great idea, some say stupid idea. But one of the real advantages is because historic districts will have a design review, it means there can be this infill, these ADUs, and still consistent with the character of the neighborhood. Now, it doesn't always work. I was posting on Facebook something positive about ADUs, and a friend of mine, preservationist in San Antonio, or in San Diego, said, yeah, it didn't work that way here. They're building, 10-unit apartment buildings in their backyard. Well, that's not what ADUs are, but mandatory relocation by institutions. Now, I'll apologize because several of you are connected, but developers around the world or around the country are often pictured as the villains. My experience is that the villains in neighborhoods are hospitals, churches, and universities that eat up neighborhoods for parking for proctologists, or I don't know what they do. But they pass themselves off. Well, we're this beneficent organization. We're for the public good. Well, yeah, but you're wrecking neighborhoods. So if, in fact, institutions buy properties and tearing them down, they ought to have to relocate those houses, find a site and relocate them so the house is not moved from the market. Ken, I don't know the situation in Charlotte or Mecklenburg County about Airbnbs. I actually really like the original concept. And that is, I have a house and I have a garage, and there's an apartment in the attic over the garage, and I can rent that out. I think that's a great thing. Makes the house more affordable to me, gives it some, I like that. That is not what Airbnbs have become. They have become corporate-owned horizontal motels, and has a serious adverse effect on neighborhoods, but even more so, those were affordable housing units, and they're now gone. So that some fraternity to drink beer and pee on the sidewalk and pay $400 a month to stay there. So general conclusions, it's both real and serious. It's not somebody's hyped up imaginary argument. It's going to get worse. Existing older housing is providing much of what affordable housing there is. And most of that is without subsidies, incentives, nothing. It's just there because the marketplace has kept it standing. That housing is being lost at a very rapid rate. New construction, so of course we have to have new construction. It has to be part of the solution, but it will never be cheap nor sufficient to answer the needs. Much of the existing older housing stock as possible need to be maintained, and there's insufficient tools currently to retain that older housing. And if making the retention of older housing is at the central element in affordable housing strategies, North Carolina and Charlotte and Mecklenburg County would be at the forefront nationally. Thanks very much. So I'm happy to take any questions, comments, alternative views. Go back to Washington, you communist. Any of those are perfectly appropriate. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I enjoyed your presentation. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And
Yeah.
I was just back there this about 2 months ago. And Cleveland, in an area that was predominantly African American, off the Euclid area, Cleveland Clinic, which is international now, went through and bought literally blocks and blocks and blocks. And they own a lot of the inner city. And all of that housing is gone. So how do you get city leaders, residents to fall back in love with older housing and to find it valuable? Because even in Charlotte, when you transplant here, everything is new.
Yeah.
We were having a conversation earlier. All those older homes are gone, or they're about to be lose. So how do you get people to fall back in love and respect that housing?
Yeah, wonderful question. And I think there's a kind of series of answers. First of all, in Cleveland, by the way, the Cleveland Restoration Society, which is the local preservation advocacy organization, they have had a long-standing program of low-interest loans for people to buy in Cleveland older housing, and they've expanded to some of the close-in suburbs. It's been very successful in kind of stabilizing neighborhood and including people's interests. Second, I think we learn by example. You can say here in Charlotte that most of the stuff is new, and I'll accept that, but there's also some fabulous older neighborhoods that we drove through some this morning. And I strongly suspect that there are neighborhoods today in Charlotte or in the county, they're kind of being, yeah, this is a plain stupid old neighborhood, that in fact, given a little attention, would start getting a lot of attention. And so I think it's an incremental thing. And I think, frankly, one of the roles of particularly the nonprofit preservation community is to highlight those under-recognized neighborhoods that have potential for doing that. The other thing I think that's related, and I've been in, I'm 142 years old, and I've been in preservation for a long time, but I think the biggest change in the preservation movement is when I started, the criteria were nearly always architectural. And so that meant, and I don't mean this is bad, I'm glad we saved it, but it meant, mansions of rich white guys who are all dead. And that the movement has really changed where now oftentimes historic districts or designation or landmarking is a result of cultural or social or associative values. So it might not have particular architectural character, but it has and oftentimes importance to the neighborhood. And I think sometimes that can be rekindled. And in fact, there are some great, and I'll tell you how that manifests itself. In Los Angeles, again, one of the most diverse places in the country, they have had a conscious effort to look for neighborhoods of character, but where that character is not architectural, where it's social or cultural or whatever. And so they end up now with a bunch of historic districts that you might drive through and say, this doesn't look like Mansion Row, and it doesn't, but it wasn't designated. And as a result, demographically, African Americans, Asians, Hispanics all have a greater percentage of the population in local historic districts than they do in the city as a whole. So this kind of mythology, well, historic preservation is kind of nice, but that's for rich white people. In fact, because they've consciously reached out and said there's more important things, they've done it. So I think all of those. I think the other example I love, it's one of my favorites, was a neighborhood in Indianapolis, and it was a historically worker neighborhood, mostly but not exclusively African American, and they created a conservation district. But instead of putting, like George Washington slept here signs, they put signs like John Johnson lives in this house, and he's been the janitor at Wilson Elementary for the last 42 years. So it was the connection with the humans, and I think that's also the way to get people interested in, oh, this neighborhood, there's kind of a great history that's happening here. So I think all of those have to be part of it. Thank you, yeah. Yeah.
I'll take that.
Can you hear me?
What do you think of Georgian land tax, and do you think that could be used as a tool to incentivize people to bring some of these vacant properties back online?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on that, and I know, friends of mine in kind of the urban business have seen it as a big, big solution. I do believe in using tax policy to achieve public ends. I'm just not convinced that that's a particularly good one, but I do think that we should look at, as you have here, with this kind of dedicating the property taxes paid on that property into, subsidizing the rent. I think that's a great use of it. I think that the trouble with having a kind of universal, instead of kind of thinking exactly what we're trying to do, is there's an opportunity for lots of unintended consequences of that. Now, having said that, vacant properties, the biggest adverse impact on the value of a residential property is proximity to a vacant or abandoned property. So we need to address it. And lots of those tax policies encourage people not to let stuff sit idle. But sometimes I'm mixed on it. I don't have a good answer because I'm just mixed on its utility. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Anyone want the mic?
Hi, I'm a reporter for the Charlotte Post. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, you talked about, denying that this is something Marxist and socialist, and I'm not going to ask you a gotcha question, but I'm curious, how our housing stock, and especially locally in Charlotte, has been decreased, and the airport has plans, the city of Charlotte and the airport have plans to create these massive manufacturing and logistics and entertainment districts that will need to be worked by people that will be paid those wages you said that cannot afford to live in the places that these places are being bulldozed down. What would be motivating that if, like you said, that people that are going to be working in these places are going to be going to need a place to live, and they can't just go to like Gastonia or Concord or something as well, because transit is another issue. So what would you say about that? What is the motivation for getting rid of this housing stock if there are these new all cookie cutter looking apartments going up?
Well, that's a fair question. I come from the real estate world, so I'm not anti-real estate at all. But the reality is that real estate capital will go to where the investment can be made with the largest margins that are available and for which there is market demand, all right? And the reality is there's a huge amount of market demand for affordable housing, for $800 apartment units. No shortage in the demand, but in fact, that's not where, if I have X dollars to invest, I can do it with 2 McMansions and make way more money, same dollar amount, make 2 McMansions for $5 million, is I can make way more money than I could if I could create units at $50,000 a unit or $100,000 a unit. So it's those two things. And I don't mean that's evil. I mean, it's the marketplace working, but it also means that we just can't leave it to the market to solve this problem, because it's not going to happen.
So I have a question about, for the leaders in the room, what city should Charlotte look to mimic, and why?
Wonderful question, and I got it earlier today. And there's probably many, but I think that in terms of really thinking comprehensively about what affordability means, what historic preservation means, I think that San Antonio is the best in the country. It just is. They're very engaging in the community. They have lots and lots of stuff that they do. They have absolutely gotten this connection between older housing stock and preservation, and they have, and led by the Preservation Office, they have passed a deconstruction ordinance there. They've gotten the council on board, and a really wide political support for both preserving the great history in San Antonio, but also seeing how that can be tied in. And they have a number, I think they have 16 residential historic districts, and and many of those are neighborhoods that are populations that are traditionally underserved. Now it's a majority Latino city, so there's lots of Hispanic neighborhoods, but again, there's some, Prince King William District is a wonderful district. You drive through and say, wow, isn't this great? And it is. But there's also really modest neighborhoods of very modest housing that the neighbors often initiated the action. So I think that's a place in terms of the combination of environmental, affordable housing and preservation efforts. I don't know of another place that is well merged as it is in San Antonio.
Donovan, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I work for a nonprofit that has access to land. And so my question to you is, what recommendation do you have for not-for-profit organizations who have access to land and want to purpose that for affordable housing?
Well, first of all, I think we cannot overestimate the important role that the nonprofit development community plays in addressing this problem. It's where it's going to come from, frankly. I love city. I love government. I'm not an anti-government thing, but I don't think local government is a very good real estate developer. So I think we have to pass it off to who does it well. Well, I think one of the things, again, if you and I were colleagues in your organization, I think I'd strike a deal with the city or the county to say, let us know anytime there's been a demolition permit applied for. And we will look at the feasibility of picking up that house and moving it to this land we have. Oftentimes the challenge of, I don't mean moving houses easy, and it's not ever the first choice for preservation, but I think here, and especially in a situation like you say, geez, we're losing this stuff every day, well, let's not lose it. Maybe maybe the purchase price on the land was such that the only thing that'll work there is a 5-story. By the way, you have 8,962 identical 5-story apartment houses have been built in the last 10 years. But I think that, and you're going to have to I would expect, do some new construction as well. But at least think about, maybe we're the place where stuff can be moved. One of the interesting things about traditional historic districts, and one of the reasons that older historic districts are different than newer ones, is that there was nearly always a wide variety of housing sizes, typologies, conditions. And when you have a wide variety of those housing choices, a wide variety of human beings opt for those choices by race, by ethnicity, by income. So I think to look I don't think it would be entirely bad that you find, oh, here's one 900 square foot bungalow, and oh, this idiot wanted to give away this 2.5-story, 4-square and move it. So I think that at least you should ask, and maybe ask for it, because it's not cheap to move them, but doesn't mean impossible. And maybe what you ask for, because by definition, if somebody applied for demolition permit, they have concluded that the vacant land is worth more than the land and the building together. So they have given less than zero value signed to the building. So if you can get some help in moving it and then put it in a new foundation, I think that at least would be part of a strategy, not your whole one, but at least one to look at. And, it's better than that stuff going to the landfill. And I think you could justify some public support saying, hey, it's about 300, you tear down a 2,500 square foot house, it's about 300 tons of crap that goes into the landfill. So I think you could make the argument on environmental grounds, fiscal grounds, affordability grounds to get kind of support for the moving costs that are going to be the expensive part of that. Might be one option. So thank you all very much for coming out.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Barfield. I'm an architect here in Charlotte, and I currently serve as the Vice Chair for Historic Landmarks Commission. I'm going to make a few very brief closing remarks, and I'm going to start by introducing a couple of other commissioners that are in the room tonight. I'll start, and I'm actually going to ask them to come join me up here too, actually, if they don't mind. Melanie Redrick is over here to my left, and you actually already earlier this evening heard from Dr. Emily Marcus as well, who are on the commission along with me. And with that, I just want to thank a couple of people, and I want to make sure I get this right, so bear with me. I'm going to read this. We want to thank the Lee Institute, UNC Charlotte Center for Community and the Art, the Masters of Science in Real Estate, and the Children's Klein Center for Real Estate. And lastly, we want to thank Mecklenburg County's Manager's Office and Historic Landmarks Department. With that being said, I'd like to share just a little bit of information about historic landmarks here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg and what we do. We are a joint commission of both Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, and we serve all of the various municipalities throughout the entire county. Since 1973, we have saved over 375 historic properties. But it's not just about the numbers and a little bit about what we heard about tonight. It's also not just about the buildings themselves. We're concentrating on stories and places in our underrepresented communities, educating the public on the importance of historic preservation, and by collaborating and using our revolving fund to save endangered buildings, and are just some of the ways that we're working to save the history and character of Mecklenburg County. Thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you.